The wall had been failing for 3 seasons, and Eli Pryor had run out of reasons to ignore it. He could see it from the kitchen window most mornings, the north boundary wall. The one his grandfather Wesley had built in 1949 using stone pulled from the creek bed and the hillside, both fitted together without mortar, the way old men in these hills had always built walls, trusting weight and angle to hold what cement would eventually crack and release. For 2 years running, the deer had been getting through the gap where a section had buckled near the old oak, and this September those deer had gotten into his winter wheat again. 3 rows of it flattened and browsed to nothing before Eli noticed the damage on his morning walk. $40 of seed. On a farm operating on the margins Eli Pryor was working, $40 was not nothing. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. He ate breakfast standing at the sink because sitting down felt too much like resting, and resting felt too much like the kind of thing a man did when he had stopped fighting. The eggs were from his own chickens. The coffee was the cheap kind in the red can, and he drank it black because cream cost money he'd rather put towards something that mattered. The light through the window was the particular thin gold of late September in eastern Kentucky, when the hills across the creek had started going amber at the tops, and the mornings came in cold enough to see your breath, but warm up fast once the sun cleared the ridge. It was the kind of morning that made the farm look like something worth keeping, which was both a comfort and a complication, because the question of whether it was worth keeping at the price he was paying to keep it was one he'd been trying to answer honestly for the better part of 3 years. His daughter Clara had called the night before from Lexington, where she worked for an architectural firm and lived in an apartment with climate control and a parking garage and a dishwasher, the details of which she mentioned with a frequency that made clear she wanted him to understand how far she'd traveled from the hollow where she'd grown up. He didn't hold that against her. A person ought to travel far from the place that raised them, at least once, just to understand what distance felt like and whether the place they left looked different from a remove. What sat uncomfortably with him was the recommendation she'd made twice this year carefully, each time delivered in the patient tone of someone who had thought through the argument and was presenting it as concern rather than as pressure. Sell the farm. Take Meridian's money. Move somewhere manageable before the knees got worse and the debt got worse and the options narrowed down to nothing. He'd told her the same thing both times, that he was fine, that the farm was fine, that things were difficult, but they had been difficult before, and the Pryors were not the kind of people who quit on a thing because it had gotten hard. Clara had not pressed after that word, quit, but he'd heard the shape of what went unsaid in the silence that followed, that she didn't think staying was the opposite of quitting. She thought staying was a different kind of surrender, slower and more dignified, but arriving at the same place. He didn't have a good answer for that yet, which was part of why the morning coffee tasted the way it did. Meridian Land Holdings had been sending letters since March. The first one had arrived on a Tuesday in a clean white envelope with raised letterhead, the language almost neighborly. Phrases about mutually beneficial opportunities and the historic value of properties like his and Meridian's deep appreciation for the agricultural families who had shaped eastern Kentucky's character. He'd read it twice and set it on the corner of the kitchen table, where it stayed for 3 days before he threw it away. The second letter came in June, the same letterhead, but the warmth reduced by a perceptible degree. This one contained a formal offer, $340,000 for the full 200 acres, including all structures, mineral rights, and surface access. $340,000 sounded like a large number until you subtracted what you owed. The farm loan from Farmers Credit of Kentucky was $180,000, taken out when the second barn roof collapsed 4 years ago, and left him choosing between a loan and watching the equipment rust under open sky. He owed $22,000 to the equipment dealer in Harlan for tractor work that had kept the machine functional through last spring's planting. He owed somewhere around $15,000 in smaller amounts, a fuel account, veterinary bills from when the cattle got sick, the electrician who'd rewired the equipment shed, property taxes that had gone up 2 years running. He tracked these in a notepad he kept in his shirt pocket because writing them down felt more honest than pretending they weren't there. After debts, Meridian's offer left him roughly $120,000, which was enough to live on for several years if he was careful, or to put a modest down payment on something smaller somewhere. or to give a portion to Clara toward a life she was already building without his help, and then to live slowly and deliberately on the remainder while the thing his family had worked for 143 years became someone else's land for someone else's purposes. He'd put the June letter in the kitchen drawer and return to it occasionally in the way you return to something you hadn't fully decided about, picking it up, setting it down, not quite reading it through again. The August letter had a deadline, December 1st, after which Meridian's offer would be withdrawn and the company would focus its attention on other acquisitions in the region. In the third paragraph, there was a phrase he'd read quickly and that had been nagging at him ever since. In light of potential resource development opportunities in the region that make timely acquisition beneficial to all parties. Resource development. It didn't sound like housing. It didn't sound like the kind of thing a company mentioned unless the land itself, rather than what sat on top of it, was what they wanted. He rinsed the coffee cup, dried it, set it in the cabinet. Then he pulled on the canvas work jacket and took the stone lifting bar from the corner of the mudroom and walked out into the September morning to do what he should have done 2 seasons ago. The north boundary wall ran about 400 feet along the property line where his land met the old Garland tract, which had been reverting to forest since the Garlands sold in the early 2000s and moved to Virginia. Locust trees and sumac had been taking the old field back 1 season at a time, and some mornings Eli could hear the succession happening in the way of things that made no sound but moved steadily. The wall held the line between what was his and what had been abandoned, and that section near the white oak had been losing the argument for going on 3 years. The oak itself was enormous. 3 grown men couldn't have reached around the trunk, and his grandfather had said it was already a large tree when Caleb Pryor first came to this land in 1881. It stood where it had always stood, neither claiming nor yielding, indifferent to the human arrangements that played out beneath it. Eli had always liked that about it. The buckled section was 40 yards from the oak. It wasn't a few stones tumbled from the top course. A whole run of the wall had shifted inward, the base stones moving where base stones had no business moving, as though something beneath had settled or shifted without announcement. The ground on the field side of the wall showed a slight depression, 3 or 4 inches lower than the surrounding turf, and the grass in that depression had a yellowish cast that Eli associated with unusual drainage or soil composition that didn't match its neighbors. He'd noticed the depression in the spring and assumed it was a low spot that had pooled water over winter. Old land accumulated small mysteries like this, places where buried debris settled after decades, spots where the soil kept its history to itself. He pulled stones from the top of the buckled section and stacked them in the order he removed them on the field side, because his grandfather had been specific about this. A dry stone wall reassembled without regard for its original arrangement was weaker than what you'd built, because the stones had worn themselves into positions that matched each other over years of settling. Reorganizing them at random was like forcing puzzle pieces together without checking the fit. The work was slow. Some stones were 50 pounds or more, and his lower back had opinions about the lifting, voiced clearly and without apology each time he straightened. His grandfather Wesley had built the north wall in 2 summers back when his hands were still capable of that kind of sustained work. Wesley had talked while he built, the way men of that generation talked, not conversation exactly, more like thinking out loud in the direction of whoever was nearby, short sentences with long silences between them that were available for filling or not. He had said things about stone and what it remembered. He'd said the land held things. Eli had been a boy beside him, passing stones when pointed to, not understanding much of it, assuming it was just the way old men filled quiet. He thought about it differently now. Wesley had built this particular section thicker than any structural need required, had done it without explanation, had spoken about the land holding things without specifying what things or where, and had never once pointed to this part of the wall as distinct from any other. The question of whether Wesley had known was one Eli could not answer. Some knowledge died with the people who held it. All that remained was the stone and the choices made around it. By mid-morning, he had cleared down to the base course of the collapsed section and crouched to examine the foundation stones, planning how to reset them. That was when he noticed the slab. It was larger than the surrounding foundation stones and oriented differently. Where every other stone in the base course was set vertical, parallel to the wall face, this one lay horizontal, flat in the base of the wall like a capstone. The wall at this point was also unusually thick, something he had never noticed before, because you rarely measured a wall's depth unless you were rebuilding it from the bottom. Here the thickness was nearly 3 feet where the rest of the wall ran to 18 inches or so. The extra depth filled in behind the face stones in a way that seemed purposeful rather than casual. He worked the bar under the edge of the flat slab. It resisted, gave a fraction, resisted again. He shifted his weight and drove the bar down, and the slab tilted, shifted, fell inward. Not onto the earth on the other side of the wall. Into something else. The sound it made when it landed was wrong. Too hollow. Too deep. The echo that followed it upward through the opening didn't belong to open ground. He straightened slowly, both hands still on the bar, and looked at what the slab had left behind. The wall at this point was hollow behind the face stones. The interior space revealed as an opening perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches tall. He could see the edge of a stone step. Below it, another step. Below that, darkness. He stood for a while before he moved again. The wind turned through the old oak with its dry September sound. The crow in the garland field called twice and went quiet. Eli's breathing stayed slow and steady in the way of a man who had spent 5 decades learning not to act in the first few seconds of a surprise, who understood that those seconds were for absorbing rather than responding. The steps were real. They were there. The situation did not require urgency, but it required attention. He crouched and shone the flashlight from his belt into the opening. 12 steps descended at a shallow angle to a stone floor. They were well-cut, not rough field stone, but dressed stone, edges squared with careful intention, each tread laid with a precision that had nothing casual about it. The walls of the stairwell were the same fitted dry stone construction as the boundary wall above, but tighter, the joints nearer to flush. Someone had done this work with specific tools over a considerable amount of time and cared about the result. The air that came up from below was cool and perfectly still and carried a smell that Eli found difficult to classify. Not decay, not the sour mineral smell of flooded ground. Something cleaner. Stone and dry earth, and underneath those, faint and metallic, the way coins smelled when you'd held a handful of them in a warm palm. A reasonable person would have gone back to the house, called someone, told them where they were going before descending alone into an underground structure on a property where they lived alone and the nearest neighbor was half a mile down the road. Eli acknowledged this to himself in the same moment he stood and walked toward the barn to get the heavy lantern. Self-reliance ran in him at a depth that caution had a hard time reaching. He had made decisions about this land alone for 25 years. Some habits were too well worn to interrupt. The lantern threw wide yellow light that filled the stairwell properly as he descended, one hand on the stone wall, testing it. No flex, no give. The wall was as solid as it had been the day it was built. The joints in the stonework were dry and clean, no water staining, no frost damage, which meant the depth was sufficient to stay below the frost line and the drainage had been well considered. Whoever had built this had thought carefully about where to put it and how it would survive. The chamber was 20 feet wide and 30 feet long. He stood at the base of the stairs and raised the lantern and looked at all of it at once before he looked at any part of it specifically, and the impression he received was of a space that had been planned as a room rather than dug as a storage pit. 2 rows of stone pillars, 5 in each row, supported a ceiling of large flat slabs spanning between them with no sagging and no visible displacement. The ceiling was low enough that Eli at 6 feet had to angle his head slightly to avoid the nearest support stones, but not so low as to feel oppressive. The floor was fitted stone, the joints tight, swept clean of debris with such thoroughness that the room must have been sealed before accumulation had a chance. The air was cold and perfectly still, the quality of air in a space that had not moved in a very long time. Along the far wall, arranged in 2 rows, were wooden crates. 40 of them, roughly. Dark wood, heavy-looking, the iron strap hardware showing only surface rust that had not run because the air here was too dry for it to progress. Each crate was approximately 2 feet long and 18 inches wide and stacked 2 high. The stenciling on the nearest one was faded but readable, Pryor Mining Survey. Eastern Kentucky, 1883 to 1891. Private. He walked to the crate slowly, the lantern swinging from his hand, and read the label again. Then he looked at the rest of the chamber. Near the base of the left-hand wall was a wooden cabinet with a drop front panel, its surface darkened with age but not warped, the hinges green with oxidation but intact, the wood holding its shape the way well-joined dry wood held in still air across many decades. Beside the cabinet, smaller than the others and set apart from the main rows, was a crate of slightly lighter wood with a handwritten label in ink that had browned but held. He went to the cabinet first. The drop front panel opened with the stiffness of a mechanism that had not moved in a very long time, but whose components were still sound. Inside the upper shelf were 3 rolls of drafting paper tied with string that had gone brittle with age, the paper yellowed at the edges but substantial. On the lower shelf was a flat tin box, its lid sealed at the seam with darkened wax. And on top of the tin box, placed where it would be impossible to overlook, was an envelope. Thick paper, yellowed at the margins, sealed with the same wax, addressed in a copperplate hand that had learned penmanship when it was still taught with rigor and maintained that rigor across a lifetime of use. To my blood, when the wall keeps its secret no longer. Eli stood with the envelope in both hands for a moment. The wax crumbled cleanly when he broke it. Inside were 3 pages, written on both sides, in the same deliberate hand. The ink had faded from black to a warm reddish-brown, but was entirely legible. The date at the top of the first page was June 14, 1891. The letter was from Caleb Pryor. He had been a surveyor. The letter established this in the first paragraph, without preamble, the way a man wrote who understood the reader needed context before conclusions. Caleb had trained as a surveyor in Virginia and had come to eastern Kentucky in 1878 in the employ of a land speculation company called the Harlan Basin Realty Trust. The trust's work was acquiring mineral rights across the coal and mineral-bearing regions of southeastern Kentucky before the railroad interests and northern capital understood what those rights were worth. Caleb had surveyed dozens of properties in those years on behalf of the trust. He had also, in 1881, surveyed his own. The purchase of the 200 acres was documented and legal. The letter said deed filed with Harlan County, properly paid for in full with money he had saved across 3 years of survey work. He did not apologize for this or explain it further than that. What he did explain was what his preliminary sampling of the property's eastern portion had suggested to him even before the purchase was complete, and why he had not shared that suggestion with anyone connected to the trust or to any other interest with the resources to act on it. Eli read this slowly. The letter was written in long, clear sentences, the reasoning sequential and unhurried, the logic of a man who had held the information for years and had arranged it carefully in his own mind before committing it to paper. Caleb had understood, early, the landscape of power he was working within. He had watched the trust acquire mineral rights from families who did not fully understand what they were signing. He had watched land separated from the wealth below it in transactions where the sellers received almost nothing relative to what the separation ultimately yielded. He had understood, with the specific clarity of a man trained to read subsurface formations and extrapolate their value, that bringing a significant discovery to the attention of 1883 would not result in his benefiting from it proportionately. It would result in pressure, displacement, or the kind of legal maneuvering that left a man with a small settlement and a binding release of all future claims. In 1883, 2 years after acquiring the land, Caleb had sunk a test bore on the eastern portion of the property. He had done this alone, with hand tools, over most of one summer. At 90 feet, the bore had entered a quartz vein. Eli's eyes moved over that sentence twice. His breathing stayed even, but his chest was not. The vein, Caleb wrote, appeared to run in a direction consistent with the regional geology, at a thickness he estimated between 4 and 8 feet across the accessible portion. The sampling he extracted showed concentrations that he described with the economical precision of a trained surveyor. Gold-bearing quartz, high-grade, the kind of formation that a competent mining engineer examining the same evidence would have recognized immediately as significant. He had not shown the evidence to anyone with those qualifications. He had understood what it meant on his own, which was sufficient. What he could not do was extract it at the scale it warranted. That required capital and equipment and a corporate structure capable of organizing production and sale, and seeking that capital meant exposing the discovery to the exact interests he had spent years watching operate. He was not willing to do that. He was also not willing to leave the deposit in the ground, undocumented, in a form that could be acquired from his heirs after his death for a fraction of its value. the way families across this region had lost things without understanding what they'd had. So he had done something else. He had extracted what he could by hand, working alone and in secret, over 8 years, with the assistance of one man he trusted whose name he gave in the letter with instructions that his descendants have no part in whatever followed. Together, across those 8 years, they had recovered a portion of what the seam contained. Caleb was careful about the estimate. He wrote that 4% was his best judgment of what they had been able to access at the depth they could reach without proper equipment. He wrote that the remaining proportion was still there, unchanged, in a formation that showed no signs of previous disturbance from any other party. Then he gave the number for what was in the crates. Eli read the number and stopped. He sat on the stone floor with the lantern balanced between his knees and the letter in both hands, and read the number again, and then looked at the crates along the far wall, 40 of them, heavy and patient and dark in the lantern light, and came to terms with what the number meant in the context of the remaining 96%. The quantity in the crates was what a man and one assistant had recovered by hand in 8 years. The quantity still in the ground was what industrial equipment, applied to a properly documented claim, could reach. He set the letter face down on the stone floor and sat with his palms on his knees and breathed the still air of the chamber for a while. He had been operating within a particular set of dimensions for so long, the dimensions of the debt, the acreage, the yield, the operating margin, that his mind had to work to accommodate numbers outside those dimensions. It kept wanting to translate the figure into terms it recognized. Debt payments, equipment, Clara's apartment in Lexington, and what a sum like this would mean in her world. None of those translations were adequate, and eventually he stopped trying to make them and just let the number sit in front of him the way an unanswered question sat, without resolution, simply present. The third page of the letter was brief. Caleb wrote that the map of the seam's location and depth, along with the survey documents proving both the vein's existence and the legal boundaries of the Pryor land, were in the tin box in the cabinet. He had built the chamber in 1883, before the extraction work was complete, so that he would have a secure and properly dry place to store what he recovered. He had built the wall above it at the same time, integrating the entrance into the wall's base so that it would be invisible from either side and from above. He had told no one about the chamber except the one man who had helped him, and had asked that man to keep the secret until death. The final paragraph was 3 sentences. Eli read them, and then set the letter carefully on top of the tin box and sat for a while without reading anything. I could not make use of this in my lifetime without losing it to men who take what they want and call it commerce. Perhaps you can. The land knows what it holds, and it held it for you. He was 52 years old. His wife Margaret had been dead for 3 years, and he still reached for her in the dark. Some mornings before memory caught up with reflex. He owed $217,000 across various debts. A land company had given him until December 1st to decide the fate of land his family had farmed for 143 years. His daughter thought the decision had already been made, and he was the last one to understand it. Those had been the terms of his life for the last several years, narrowing, incremental, defined by what was owed and what was failing and what the options were when you added those two things together. He climbed the 12 steps back into the September air, which felt different on his face than it had 2 hours earlier. Warmer, or perhaps just more present. He pulled the equipment tarp from the trailer and weighted it across the opening in the wall with loose stones, then walked back to the house and stood at the kitchen sink for a long time without doing anything in particular. That evening he did not call Clara. He held the phone twice and set it down both times. What he had was a letter and an underground room, and 4 small gold bars he hadn't yet opened. It was not yet the thing itself. It was the beginning of the thing, and bringing the beginning to Clara before he understood the thing would mean managing her responses and the particular way she processed surprising information out loud, which was thorough and sequential and time-consuming, and which frequently arrived at conclusions she was confident about before he'd had time to reach his own. He would call her when he knew more. He slept badly, which was not unusual, and woke before 5 to the sound of the creek and the quality of darkness that came just before the birds started. He made coffee, stood at the window, looked at the tarp over the opening in the north wall, just barely visible from the house in the security light from the barn. He went back down in the morning before the dew had fully lifted. The smaller crate, the one with the handwritten label, sat where he'd left it beside the cabinet. He worked the lid off with the pry bar, careful with the old wood. Inside, packed in straw that had compacted over the decades into a dense mat of brown fiber, were several objects wrapped in oilcloth, the kind treated with linseed oil that had been used for weatherproofing before modern materials made it obsolete. The oilcloth had done its job. He unwrapped the first object carefully. A gold bar, about 5 inches long and 2 inches wide, cast in a homemade mold, the surface showing the grain of the metal and the small imperfections that came from a simple casting process, real, in the way that handmade things were real, bearing the marks of the hands that had shaped them. The weight of it in his palm was the weight of a dense and genuinely heavy thing, not theatrical, just true. Stamped into one face was a date, 1887. He set it on the floor and unwrapped the second. Another bar, slightly larger, dated 1889. The third was 1886. The fourth, the largest of the group, had a date and 2 letters pressed into its face. CP. He held it in both hands. Caleb Pryor's initials on the last bar he had cast before writing the letter and sealing the chamber and walking back up these same 12 steps into the light of a world that would never know what he'd left behind, who had gone back to farming above it, who had built his family above it, who had trusted that patience was not the same as passivity and that the future was not an abstraction but a specific place where specific people would stand and be ready. Eli's hands were steady. His chest was not. The feeling that moved through him was not the clean, triumphant thing a man might expect, finding something like this. It was more complicated gratitude and grief moving through the same channel, mixed with a weight of obligation that settled in a specific place below the sternum and did not feel like burden exactly, but did not feel light either. He had been left something by someone who had trusted the future, who had believed the right person would find it at the right time, and the trust was specific enough that it had a name on it. He thought about what it had cost Caleb Pryor to do this, not the labor of the extraction, which had been physical and difficult but straightforward in its demands, but the other cost. The cost of knowing something and saying nothing, of watching the trust operate around him, watching other families lose mineral rights for prices that looked fair until you understood what the minerals were worth, and saying nothing because saying something would have ended his own claim before he could act on it, of building a wall above a secret, and going back to farming and trusting that the future would be different from the present in the specific way that mattered. That was not the cost of a simple man or a dishonest one. That was the cost of someone who had done a careful reckoning and understood that the long patience was the only viable strategy. He rewrapped the bars in their oilcloth, fitted them back into the compacted straw, replaced the lid on the crate. Then he climbed out into the September morning for the second time and stood in the ordinary air of the farm and made a list in his head of what he needed to do next, and in what order. 2 things were essential. A geologist who could evaluate the survey documents and assess whether Caleb's description of the vein was geologically consistent, and a lawyer with specific experience in mineral rights at the scale this appeared to involve. He could not pursue either without revealing the discovery, and revealing the discovery to the wrong person at the wrong stage would create problems he could anticipate in general form even if he couldn't see their specific shape yet. Meridian had used the phrase resource development opportunities. He needed to understand what that meant and whether they already had information about his land's subsurface composition before anyone with a stake in that question found out what was under the north wall. He drove to town in the afternoon. He had no specific errand, but the farm felt different now in a way he wasn't ready to sit inside alone, and the ordinary sensation of a street with people moving through their days gave him something to push against that wasn't his own thoughts. He bought coffee at the gas station and sat in the truck in the parking lot for half an hour, watching the afternoon. He called the county courthouse from the truck. A clerk told him historical surveys before 1920 were in the basement archive on physical paper, public hours listed on the website. He found Gerald Marsh's name through a county extension newsletter article from 2013 about limestone sinkhole consulting in the region. Gerald was described as a field geologist affiliated with the University of Kentucky, the kind who did practical work for rural communities. The number led to a university voicemail. Eli left a careful message. A farmer in Harlan County with an unusual underground structure on his property showing evidence of historical geological survey work, looking for a professional who could help him evaluate what he'd found. He left his number and said any morning this week was fine. He thought about Clara twice on the drive home and stopped himself both times before the thought became a call. What he needed from her was not yet something he could ask for. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Wednesday morning, he spent in the county archive basement. The record room was everything a courthouse basement would be: fluorescent tubes, metal shelving, flat boxes organized by decade, the smell of old paper in still air. A younger clerk found the Pryor property records quickly: 2 flat boxes and a large envelope of folded maps. Caleb's original surveys were on drafting paper that had yellowed at the margins but remained fully legible: property boundaries, elevation contours, drainage patterns, the careful notations of a man trained in precision. On one survey dated 1885, in the lower right corner, written in red ink, Ref Test Bore, E, Sector, File 7, Private. A line from the notation pointed to the eastern portion of the property. File 7, Private. Not here. Not deposited with the county. Something Caleb had kept himself, which meant it was almost certainly in the tin box in the sealed cabinet in the sealed room under the sealed wall. He spent longer in the basement than was strictly necessary. He pulled survey maps from neighboring properties filed in the same period, comparing their structure and notation style with Caleb's work, and found that Caleb's were more detailed and more precise than anyone else filing in those years, the mark of a man trained to a higher standard than the county required. He pulled the deed filing from 1881 and read it twice, checking the boundary description against what he knew of the land, finding the legal language internally consistent and clearly prepared by someone who understood what they were doing. No gaps, no ambiguities, no language that could be later read to exclude what lay below the surface. Caleb had been careful about the deed. He had wanted there to be no question about what the land comprised. Eli made photocopies of everything relevant, paid the clerk 40 cents a page, drove home in the afternoon. Gerald Marsh called Thursday morning. His voice had the economical quality of a man who'd spent decades explaining complicated things to people who were not geologists and had developed a manner that moved efficiently from greeting to information. He asked Eli to describe what he'd found. Eli described it plainly: the chamber, the construction, the crates, the cabinet, the letter from Caleb Pryor, the survey documents referenced in that letter, and the gold bars, which he mentioned last, plainly, as a fact rather than a revelation. There was a pause on the line. "How much gold?" Gerald asked. "I haven't opened the large crates." The letter estimates the total weight as something 3 strong men couldn't lift together. The small crate had 4 bars, varying sizes. The pause that followed was longer. "I'm in Harlan Thursday for another matter," Gerald said. "Could I come by in the afternoon?" Thursday afternoon was fine. They walked to the wall after lunch, the September light full and honest, the kind of light that didn't soften edges. Gerald crouched at the opening and shone his own flashlight into the stairwell and said nothing for close to a minute. Then, dry stone vaulting underground, fitted courses. Unusual for this region in this period. He went down the steps with one hand on the wall, Eli following. In the chamber, Gerald moved with the systematic care of a man who'd been in many unusual spaces and understood that looking came before touching, and that looking properly took time. He examined the ceiling construction from multiple angles. He tapped several stones and listened to what came back. He checked the joints in the walls with 2 fingers, testing for moisture, for looseness, finding neither. When he reached the crates, he read the labels without touching them, and then turned to the cabinet and the tin box for a long time before Eli handed over the small pry bar he'd brought. The wax seals on the rolled documents cracked and fell cleanly. Gerald unrolled the first map on the stone floor. Weighting the corners with river pebbles he took from his coat pocket apparently, he carried them as a professional habit and examined it with the focused quiet of someone reading something important rather than just looking at it. The map was Caleb's underground survey, the one referenced in the county records as File 7, private. It showed the shaft, the test bores, the vein, sampling notations in red ink at intervals along its length, and at the bottom a set of calculations and a tonnage figure. Gerald looked at it for a long time. He pulled a folding ruler from his coat and measured the width of the vein notation at 3 separate points. He checked the depth annotation in the bore column against known geological tables in a small reference book he produced from another pocket. He stood and walked the length of the chamber, looking at the ceiling construction again, tapping pillars at intervals, and Eli could see him building something in his head, a picture of what this room had cost in labor and skill and time. What kind of man had built it? What he had understood about what he was protecting and why protection was necessary. "This is a mine survey," he said finally. "A proper one, done by someone who knew how to take measurements underground and translate them to a surface map accurately." He pointed to the notations. "Gold-bearing quartz vein indicators. These numbers are vein thickness at sampling points. And this figure at the bottom is a tonnage estimate." "Is it accurate?" Eli asked. "For 1885. Gerald's finger traced one of the measurement sequences. "Conservative, if anything. A modern survey would likely come in higher." He sat back on his heels and was quiet for a moment. Then, "You said a land company has been trying to buy this property." "Meridian Land Holdings. Since March." "Before you take another step," Gerald said, "find out who actually owns Meridian. Not who signs the letters. The parent company, the principals. Someone has been pursuing this land on a deadline for a reason. And if they've been at it since March, they may have information about the subsurface that they believe you don't have." He looked at the map again. "You've been sitting on something very significant. Proceed as though other people already know it." He helped Eli photograph every document in the tin box and in the cabinet rolls before they came back up, careful with each sheet, building a complete photographic record. He said he'd prepare a personal technical letter assessing the geological evidence, not a university document. Just his professional judgment in a letter to Eli within the week. At the opening to the stairwell, before he climbed out into the afternoon, he looked back down at the chamber one more time with an expression that had complexity in it, something between wonder and the specific tiredness of a scientist who had watched enough discoveries get swallowed by the interests that surrounded them. "Your ancestor built something extraordinary here," Gerald said. He understood what he had and understood who would try to take it, and chose patience over immediate gain. He paused. "Make sure you have a lawyer before this goes further. Someone with mineral rights experience at a real scale. Not local." The truck drove down the farm lane, and the sound of it faded into the trees, and Eli was alone again. He went back down one more time that evening, by himself, with the lantern. He sat on the stone floor in the middle of the chamber and let the light stay steady around him. The air was exactly what it had been when he first descended, cool, still, carrying its faint metallic undercurrent. The 40 crates stood in their rows along the far wall with the patience of objects that had waited 132 years and had learned not to be impatient about whatever came next. He took the notepad from his shirt pocket. The column of debts was there in his own handwriting, 3 years of additions. $180,000, $22,000, $15,000. The numbers that had defined the shape of his options for long enough that he'd stopped thinking of them as temporary conditions and started thinking of them as permanent ones. He drew a line in the margin beside the column. Not through the numbers, they were still real, still his, but beside them. The way you marked something you intended to return to with better information than you currently had. December 1st was 10 weeks out. Gerald was writing a geological assessment. He needed a lawyer with mineral rights expertise, someone he found through a bar referral service rather than through local connections that Meridian's money might have already reached. He needed to know who Meridian actually was and what they already understood about this land. He needed to document the contents of the large crates before he told anyone else what he'd found, because documentation was the only thing that prevented disputes about what had originally been there, the kind of disputes that well-funded adversaries could manufacture if they chose. He needed to do all of this carefully, and he needed to do it before anyone who was already watching this farm understood that something had changed. The word carefully kept returning to him. Gerald had said it without elaborating. Eli understood the elaboration without hearing it. Careful meant in the right sequence, documented properly, with allies who had no stake in the outcome except that the outcome was honest. Careful meant not moving faster than your understanding and not slower than the situation required. It meant the gap between the present and December 1st was not a deadline, so much as a clock he could use if he started immediately and did not lose time to hesitation or to the kind of pride that made men want to solve things alone when solving them alone was the less intelligent choice. Caleb Pryor had built this room in 1883 and addressed an envelope to the future and trusted that the future would be ready. He had been right about the first part. Whether the second part was true remained to be seen, and it would depend on what Eli did with the next 10 weeks. He stood and picked up the lantern and looked at the chamber one last time, at the ceiling the pillars held, at the floor fitted tight by hands that had been dead for a century, at the crates that held what those hands had recovered from 90 feet below his land, and then climbed the 12 steps into the September air, which had gone cold now that the sun was down, and covered the opening again, and walked back to the house to find out who owned Meridian land holdings. The farm lane was empty when he reached the house. He'd noticed a dark sedan parked at the junction of the lane and the county road. When he drove in from town on Wednesday, idling at the shoulder for no apparent reason, it had been gone by the time he came back out. He'd thought nothing of it at the time. Now he thought about it again. He went inside and made dinner and sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, which was slow and which he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and started looking. Meridian Land Holdings, incorporated in Delaware, registered agent in Louisville, principal contact Marcus Hale. He searched Marcus Hale. The name came back connected to 3 other LLCs and 1 dissolved corporation that had been involved in natural resource acquisition in eastern Kentucky and southwestern Virginia. He searched those names. One of them connected to a subsidiary of a larger company headquartered in Houston, Consolidated Resource Partners, which was a portfolio company of a private equity firm called Grayfield Capital that had positions in mineral extraction across Appalachia. Eli wrote the names on a piece of paper and set it on the table next to Meridian's August letter. He put the August letter face up this time and read the phrase about resource development opportunities one more time, and it meant something different now than it had when he'd first read it. Grayfield Capital had been operating in Appalachia for 11 years according to a trade press profile he found. Their stated investment thesis was acquiring undervalued natural resource assets in advance of commodity cycle upswings. They had acquired mineral rights in 4 counties in eastern Kentucky in the last 3 years, each transaction conducted through a different shell company, each company dissolving after the acquisition closed. The pattern was deliberate. It was the kind of structure you built when you did not want the scale of your operation visible to the people you were dealing with. He turned the letter face down and went to wash the dinner dishes. Outside, the farm was dark and quiet in the way of late September, the creek audible, the hills across it invisible against the sky. Somewhere under the north field, at 90 feet of depth, a quartz vein ran through the earth that had been in his family's name for 143 years, and someone in Houston had sent a man with a deadline to a farm in eastern Kentucky, and Eli Pryor had 10 weeks to understand all of this more thoroughly than they did. He dried his hands and thought about Raymond, his father, who had worked this land for 40 years and died without knowing what he'd worked above. Raymond had never said anything unusual about the North Wall. Neither had his mother, who had grown up here and married here and lived here until Alzheimer's took her language away, and then the rest. Whatever Wesley had known, if he had known anything, he had carried it with the same discretion as Caleb had carried his own knowledge, one generation not burdening the next with a secret that had no clean resolution yet. Or perhaps Wesley had not known. Perhaps the knowledge had skipped a generation somewhere, or been written down in something that hadn't survived, or been trusted to a confidence that had held so well it had disappeared entirely. None of that was answerable now. What was answerable was what came next. He dried his hands and looked out the kitchen window at the security light on the barn and the darkness beyond it toward the north wall. The wall kept its secret no longer. The question now was who else was going to learn it, and when, and on whose terms. He had spent 3 years making peace with the idea that this land was a weight he would eventually set down. He understood now that the weight was different than he'd thought, not the weight of obligation and debt, but the weight of something that had been carried a very long time and was only now being handed over. You didn't set that down. You carried it differently, with better knowledge of what it was. He went to bed. He did not sleep well, but he did not expect to. He woke before 5 again the next morning and the morning after that, and by the third day the early waking had become the schedule rather than the exception. The thinking he needed to do worked better in the dark hours. The phone didn't ring. The farm sat quiet in the way it sat before any farm work began. He could sit with the coffee at the kitchen table and arrange the next steps in his head without anyone reaching him until he was ready to be reached. The first call he made on Monday was to the Kentucky Bar Association's referral service, which connected him to a panel of attorneys vetted for specific practice areas. He asked for mineral rights, specifically historical claims and corporate adversaries. The woman on the phone asked clarifying questions in the patient tone of someone who'd done this many times and gave him 3 names. He wrote them on the notepad below the debts. Helen O'Rourke in Lexington, Daniel Stoltz in Louisville, a firm in Charleston that specialized in West Virginia work but had Kentucky licensed partners. He called Helen O'Rourke first because Lexington was closest and because the name had come up first on the referral list, which the woman had said was based on geographic match and practice depth rather than alphabetical order. He reached a paralegal who took his information and said Ms. Rourke would call him back. He didn't say what the matter was. He said only that it concerned a property in Harlan County with a historical mineral claim and a corporate party making acquisition offers under a deadline. Helen O'Rourke called back at 2 in the afternoon. Her voice carried the kind of efficient directness that Eli associated with people who billed by the hour and did not pad the bill. She listened to his description without interrupting. He gave the outline of what he'd found without giving the specifics: a chamber, survey documents, evidence of historical extraction work, indications of significant subsurface mineral deposits, and a land company that had been pursuing the property since March with a December deadline. He did not name the deposit. He did not name Meridian. He did not say gold. There was a pause when he finished. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "I'm going to ask you to be more specific because the level of caution you're using suggests this is bigger than what you've described. I can't help you well if I don't know what we're dealing with." He thought for a moment. Then he told her the vein, the depth, the estimated tonnage from Caleb's 1885 survey, the bars in the small crate, the unopened crates along the far wall, the letter, and what it said about the remaining proportion still in the ground. He told her Gerald Marsh had reviewed the survey documentation and described the deposit as conservatively estimated. Another pause. "Longer. I'll come to you on Wednesday," she said. "I want to see the chamber before I do anything else. Don't tell anyone else what's there until I do. Don't sign anything Meridian sends you. Don't speak to anyone representing them or anyone connected to them. If they call, take a message and tell them your attorney will be in touch. Do you have my number written down?" He did. He had it on the notepad. "Write attorney next to it," she said. "If anyone asks who I am, that's the answer they get. Helen O'Rourke, your attorney." That phrase changes the legal posture of every interaction. "I'll see you Wednesday." She paused. "One more thing. If anyone shows up at the property in person before I get there, a man with a clipboard, a woman doing a county survey, anyone in a uniform that doesn't match the truck they drove in on, do not let them inside any structure. Do not let them photograph anything. Politely tell them you're not available and ask them to leave. Take down a license plate if you can do it without being obvious. Some firms send investigators to map a property before they negotiate. We don't make that easy for them." "Understood." She hung up before he had finished saying thank you. He sat for a moment looking at the notepad. Helen O'Rourke, attorney. Below it, the column of debts, the line drawn in the margin, and now a name with a function attached to it. The list of things he was managing was no longer one he was managing alone. Tuesday, he opened the first of the large crates. He went down with the lantern and his phone and a small notebook in which he'd been planning to catalog the contents. He'd thought through how to do it. The crates were stacked 2 high in 2 rows along the far wall. He would work through them in order, opening one at a time, photographing the contents from multiple angles, recording the dimensions and approximate weight of what was inside, replacing the contents and resealing the crate as best he could before moving to the next. The goal was documentation thorough enough that no one could later dispute what had originally been there. Gerald had said it. Helena had implied it. Documentation was the only defense against the kind of disputes that well-resourced adversaries could manufacture from nothing. The first crate's lid resisted the pry bar more than the small crates had. The wood was thicker, the iron straps heavier. When the lid came off, he set it carefully on the floor and shone the lantern inside. The contents were arranged in a way that suggested Caleb had thought about preservation when he packed. A layer of straw at the top, then oilcloth wrapping, then objects packed close together with smaller straw bundles between them to prevent movement. Eli lifted the oilcloth back. 12 gold bars, each one approximately twice the size of the bars in the small crate, cast in the same homemade molds, with the slightly irregular surfaces and visible grain that marked them as the product of a simple process performed carefully. Each bore a date on one face. He saw 1884, 1885, 1885 again, 1886. The bars were arranged in 2 rows of 6, packed tightly enough that they barely moved when he tilted the crate. He lifted one out. It was heavier than the small bars had been, considerably so, and his back recommended that he set it down before he considered lifting another. He worked with a deliberateness that surprised him. The task itself was repetitive, and the contents were repetitive bars in oilcloth, in straw, in wood, but each crate was a small, contained ceremony. He found himself thinking about the act of casting that had produced each bar. Caleb and his unnamed assistant in the shaft at 90 feet, working a small smelter that Caleb must also have built, pouring molten gold into molds Caleb must also have made, stamping each bar with the year so that the order of the work would never be in doubt. The labor was not glamorous. It was sustained and methodical and performed without witnesses, the way most important work was performed. Eli felt a kinship with it that he hadn't expected. He'd spent his adult life doing sustained methodical work without witnesses. He'd done it with crops instead of metal, but the texture of the labor was the same. He photographed the bars in the crate from above with the lantern positioned to show the surface detail. He photographed the date on each one individually. He removed each bar and weighed it on the small kitchen scale. He'd brought down a 5-pound digital scale that maxed out before reaching the weight of the largest bars. He noted the bars that exceeded the scale's range with the notation, exceeds 5 pounds, and an approximate visual estimate. He photographed the inside of the empty crate, the wood grain, the iron strap construction, the stenciling on the lid panel. Then he replaced everything. He fitted each bar back into its oilcloth, packed them in the same arrangement they'd been in, replaced the upper layer of straw, set the lid back on, and pressed it down firmly even though the original nails would not reset. He moved to the second crate. The work took most of Tuesday. He paced himself, came up for water, and breaks every 90 minutes. Ate lunch at the kitchen table with the photographs already loading from his phone to a cloud backup that Helena would access remotely later. By late afternoon, he'd opened and documented 8 of the 40 crates. The contents were consistent across all 8, gold bars cast in the same molds, dated between 1883 and 1891, arranged with the same care, packed with the same materials. The total weight he'd documented across those 8 crates was approximately 480 pounds. He had 32 crates still to go. He sat at the kitchen table that evening and looked at the numbers in his notepad. 8 crates at roughly 60 pounds each. If the remaining 32 were consistent, the total would be in the range of 2,400 pounds. He did the conversion to troy ounces, then to current market price. He did it twice because he wanted to be sure he hadn't dropped a digit somewhere. The figure he reached was uncomfortable to look at. He wrote it in the notepad in pencil because pen felt too permanent. What was in the crates, at current prices, was somewhere between $60 and $70 million, depending on purity and the spread on gold sales of this kind of historical provenance. That was not the deposit. The deposit was the remaining 96%, the portion Caleb had not been able to reach with hand tools, the portion still in the ground at 90 feet of depth across a vein 4 to 8 feet thick. That figure was not something Eli was going to write in his notepad. That figure existed and would be addressed by people qualified to address it: Helena, Gerald, whoever they would eventually bring in to do a modern survey. For now, he had the crates. He had Caleb's documentation. He had a lawyer arriving in less than 24 hours. He slept badly again. He didn't expect any different. Helena arrived Wednesday at 10 in the morning. She drove a dark green sedan that had been driven by a person who used it as a tool rather than as a statement, and she emerged from it carrying a briefcase, a portable photographic tripod, and a thermos of coffee. She was in her late 40s, shorter than he'd expected based on the voice, with the kind of direct gaze that had been honed across enough difficult conversations to be unembarrassed by anyone she was looking at. She shook his hand briefly. "Show me the chamber." He showed her the chamber. She descended the steps with the same care Gerald had used, one hand on the wall, the lantern in front of her. At the bottom, she stood for a moment and looked at the room as a whole before she looked at any specific part of it. Then she walked the perimeter, examining the construction, the crates, the cabinet, the rolled documents Gerald had photographed but which Eli had left in place. She didn't touch anything except the surfaces necessary for her own assessment. She had the careful manner of a person who understood that evidence had to be preserved in the condition in which it had been found. When she finished walking the chamber, she sat on the lower step of the stairwell, took a notepad from her briefcase, and asked him to tell her the story from the beginning. Not just the discovery, the history, the farm, the family, the debts, the Meridian letters, the way the offer had been worded, his daughter's recommendation that he sell, his decision not to. He told her. It took close to 40 minutes. She wrote occasionally, asked clarifying questions twice, and listened the rest of the time with the kind of attention that did not feel like surveillance so much as it felt like a person taking the work seriously enough not to pretend. When he finished, she sat with her notepad on her knees and was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Pryor," she said, "I'm going to give you the picture as I see it, and then I'm going to tell you what we do. Stop me if anything I say doesn't match what you understand." He nodded. "Your great-great-grandfather purchased this land in 1881 with a properly documented deed and clear title. He surveyed it himself, discovered the vein, chose not to disclose it, extracted a portion by hand over 8 years, and concealed both the extracted material and the documentation of the deposit in this chamber. The deed has remained in the family continuously since 1881 with no severance of mineral rights, no surface-only sales, no transactions that would have separated the subsurface estate from the surface estate. Is that correct?" "As far as I know. You'll need to verify it. I'll do that this week through the county records. If it's correct, you currently hold full mineral rights on this property, including the deposit. Your ownership of what is in the ground is not in legal doubt, assuming the chain of title is clean. The first thing we do is verify that chain." She turned a page in her notepad. "Second, Meridian Land Holdings. From what you've described, Meridian's behavior pattern is consistent with corporate acquisitions targeting known or suspected resource assets. The phrase resource development opportunities in their letter is a tell. Companies that buy farmland for housing or commercial development don't write that phrase. Companies that buy land because they know or suspect something is in it under it do. Grayfield Capital is the parent. Consolidated Resource Partners is their portfolio company. Marcus Hale is a known acquirer who works the Appalachian region for this kind of project. I've encountered him in 2 prior matters. He is professional, persistent, and willing to use the full range of pressure tactics short of conduct that would expose his employer to direct liability. He will not threaten you in any way that creates a record. He will arrange for circumstances that produce pressure without ever being traceable to him. What kind of circumstances? Tax revaluations, permit complications, bank reviews of your credit standing, suddenly attentive code enforcement, family members receiving employment offers contingent on convincing you, equipment failures, theft, vandalism, increased traffic on the road past your farm, a car parked at the end of your driveway that always leaves before you can confront it, none of it ever traceable to Grayfield. All of it designed to convince you that the easy thing is to sign the offer and walk away." She looked at him steadily. "They will not threaten your physical safety. That's not how this firm operates. But they will make your life uncomfortable in many small ways at once. You should expect this to begin within days of any move we make that signals you're not going to sell." He let that sit for a moment. "What do we do?" 3 things in sequence. First, we verify the chain of title and the boundaries. I do that this week. Second, we file a notice of claim with the Kentucky Department for Natural Resources establishing your existing mineral rights and putting on the public record that you are aware of subsurface resources on this property. That filing changes the legal landscape because it eliminates any later argument that you sold without knowing what was there. Third, we engage a licensed mining engineer to perform a modern survey of the deposit, not for extraction, for valuation. Once we have a current professional valuation, we have leverage we don't currently have, and we know what we're dealing with at a level that Meridian probably already does, but we don't. And the crates. The crates are yours. Property of the estate, inherited through clear succession from the original owner. The historical provenance actually increases their value, because gold of documented historical origin and predating modern refining processes commands a premium from collectors and certain specialty buyers. We don't need to sell any of it now. We document it, place it in proper storage, and use its existence as collateral if at any point we need to fund the litigation that may follow. She closed the notepad and opened it again to a fresh page. One other thing you should understand. The reason this deposit was suppressed in 1891 is the same reason it would be contested now. Industrial mineral extraction is a public-facing activity. It requires permits, environmental review, and notification of adjacent landowners. If Meridian were to acquire the property and operate it, every step would be visible in the public record. They cannot bury the activity. What they can do is bury the price they paid for the land. That's why the confidentiality clauses will keep appearing in their offers. They need the precedent suppressed. The minute the market knows what they're paying for land with this kind of subsurface profile, every adjacent landholder becomes more expensive. The economic structure of their business depends on information asymmetry, and your filing has just begun to dismantle that asymmetry. She closed the notepad. This is going to be a 6 to 18-month process if Meridian fights US, which I expect they will. It will require patience. There will be moments when accepting a settlement looks like the easier path. Whether you accept any settlement they offer is your decision, not mine. My job is to ensure that whatever decision you make is made with full information and full legal protection. Do you understand? He understood. She spent another hour in the chamber documenting what was visible from the doorway with her own camera and tripod, then climbed the steps with him following. At the wall she paused. Cover this opening when you're not down here. Lock it if you can rig a way to. The fewer people who know this chamber exists, the better, until we're ready for people to know. Your daughter, does she know? Not yet. Tell her soon. You'll want her informed and on the same page when things start moving. Do not tell anyone else. Not your neighbor, not anyone you trust at the diner, not your minister if you have one. The legal protection we're building works only if the information stays inside a circle small enough to track. He nodded. She got in her sedan and drove down the lane and was gone, and Eli stood at the wall and looked at the tarp over the opening and understood that the next phase had begun. He called Clara that evening. He'd practiced the opening sentences in the truck on his way back from town. He wasn't going to lead with the discovery itself. He was going to lead with the broader situation that something had happened on the farm that required her to come down for a weekend, that he needed her presence rather than a phone conversation, that he was not in distress, but the situation was significant enough that explanation by phone was inadequate. She picked up on the third ring. He could hear traffic behind her, which meant she was walking somewhere in Lexington, which meant the conversation would have to be brief. Dad, what's wrong? Nothing's wrong, but I need you to come down this weekend if you can. There was a pause. She was sharper than he was about reading what was said by what wasn't. He heard her shift the phone, heard the traffic noise reduce slightly, as she presumably stepped into a doorway or alcove. Tell me what's happening. I'd rather show you. It's not something that explains well on the phone. It's not bad news, but it's not nothing. Can you come Saturday? Another pause. Yes, I can. Should I bring anything? Just yourself. Dad. Yes. Are you in trouble? No, I'm not in trouble. I want you to see something. She agreed to come Saturday morning, said she'd leave early, said she could stay through Sunday if needed. He thanked her and hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after. The conversation had gone better than he'd expected. Clara had not pressed for information he wasn't ready to give. She'd accepted his framing and committed to the trip. He understood that this restraint on her part was probably an indication that she'd heard something in his voice that was sufficiently unusual that she'd decided to follow rather than question. That registered as both gratitude and as something more complicated. She was treating him with a care that suggested she'd been worried about him in ways he hadn't fully appreciated. He worked the crates the rest of the week. By Friday evening, he had documented 20 of the 40. The pattern was consistent. Each crate held between 10 and 14 gold bars depending on size, all cast in similar molds, dated between 1883 and 1891. He'd revised his estimate of total weight upward slightly. The figure he wrote in pencil at the bottom of the notepad now sat closer to $75 million, and his confidence in that figure was increasing each day. The first sign that Meridian had noticed something was the car at the end of the lane on Thursday afternoon. It was a different car from the one he'd seen Wednesday, dark blue this time. A mid-sized sedan with tinted windows, parked on the shoulder where the farm lane met the county road. It was there for about 20 minutes by Eli's estimate. He saw it when he was driving back from town with feed for the chickens. By the time he reached the junction, it was pulling away. He watched it go in the rearview mirror until it disappeared around the bend. The second sign was the letter Friday morning, hand-delivered, in an unmarked envelope under the screen door when he came out for coffee. Meridian letterhead. The same legal language as the previous letters, but with a difference in tone. A paragraph about how Meridian valued direct communication with property owners and would welcome the opportunity to meet in person at Eli's convenience to discuss the transaction. The letter was signed by Marcus Hale, with a phone number for direct contact. Eli photographed the letter and the envelope and sent both to Helena's office. He did not call the number. The third sign was the property tax notice on Saturday. The county assessor had issued a revised assessment for the property based on a routine update of agricultural land valuations in the region. The new assessment was 187% of the old one, with the explanation that recent land transactions in adjacent counties had revealed higher market values for properties of this size and use. The notice came with a 30-day window for filing an appeal and a notification that the new annual property tax bill would be approximately $9,200 instead of the $4,900 he'd been paying. He showed the notice to Helena by photograph that afternoon. She replied within an hour. Standard pressure tactic. We'll file an appeal Monday. Not unprecedented for assessors to do this in counties where there's been local resource interest, and the timing is consistent with what we discussed. He thanked her. He set the notice on the kitchen table next to Meridian's letter. He went out to wait for Clara. She arrived at 10 in the morning, driving the small, efficient car she'd bought when she moved to Lexington, and she emerged from it wearing the kind of practical clothes that suggested she'd taken his request seriously. She hugged him at the door longer than she usually did. She stepped back and looked at him with the focused attention of someone who had spent the drive thinking about what she might be walking into. You look tired. I haven't been sleeping much. Why? That's part of what I want to show you. He made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table. He told her the story from the beginning, the way he'd told Helena, but slower and with more of the emotional context: the morning at the wall, the slab falling inward, the descent, the letter from Caleb, the small crate, the C.P. bar. He showed her the photographs he'd been taking. He showed her the notepad with the figures. Clara sat very still through most of it. When he got to the figure at the bottom of the notepad, she set her coffee down. Dad, I know. I know. She was quiet for a while. Then, why didn't you tell me sooner? Because until Helena Rourke came on Wednesday, I didn't fully understand what I had. And because telling you was going to change something between us that I wanted to be certain about before I changed it. Change what? Your sense of what I'm doing here. Whether the farm is something I'm holding on to out of stubbornness or whether there's a reason. I didn't want to call you with a wild story and have you decide I'd lost my judgment. I wanted to call you when I had a lawyer and a geologist and a plan. She nodded slowly. He watched her work through it. Clara processed surprising information by laying out the pieces in a specific order, addressing each one, and then arriving at a conclusion. He watched her do that now, the same way she'd done it as a child when something unexpected had happened, the same slight tilt of the head, the same way of looking past whoever was speaking while she thought. I want to see it. Of course. He took her to the wall. He pulled back the tarp. He led her down the 12 steps with the lantern, and she followed him into the chamber and stood at the base of the stairs and looked at the room the way Helena and Gerald had looked at it, taking the whole thing in before addressing any specific part of it. Oh, Dad. He didn't say anything. He let her stand. She walked to the crates, touched the top of one with her palm flat against the wood. She walked to the cabinet, looked at the rolls of documents and the tin box. She read the stenciling on the crates and the handwriting on the smaller one. She looked at the ceiling and the pillars and the floor. Then she came back to where he was standing and stood beside him and didn't say anything for what felt like a long time. I told you to sell. You did. I told you twice. Yes. I'm sorry. You don't have to be. You were giving me your honest opinion based on what you knew. That's what I want from you. I'd rather you tell me to sell when you think I should sell than agree with me to be agreeable. You did your job as my daughter. He thought about how much of fatherhood was getting the timing wrong on what you said and what you didn't say, recommending direction to a child who needed her own discoveries, withholding direction from a child who needed yours. He had withheld this from Clara not out of mistrust, but because explaining it on the phone would have been an act of management rather than communication, and Clara deserved better than to be managed. She had received the explanation in person, in the chamber, with the evidence in front of her, and her response had been the one he'd hoped for without daring to expect. She had taken it in, sat with it, and ended an apology not for being wrong, but for not seeing what he had been carrying. That was the kind of daughter he had raised. He had not always been certain he'd done a sufficient job of the raising. The chamber, in a way he hadn't anticipated, was reassuring him on that question too. She put her hand on his arm. They stood for another moment in the chamber, the lantern between them, the air the same still air it had been when he first descended. How are you sleeping? Poorly. Are you eating? Yes. Okay. I'm going to stay through the week. I'll work remotely. The firm is fine with it for a few days. I want to be here when whatever's going to happen next happens. Clara, Dad, I'm not arguing. I'm telling you what I'm doing. He nodded. They walked back up the steps into the September air. He covered the opening with the tarp and weighted the corners. Clara stood at the wall and looked at the tarp for a moment. Wesley built this. Wesley built the wall above it. Caleb built what's below. We don't know if Wesley knew. I think he probably knew. Why? Because of the way you've always talked about him. The careful way. Some men keep secrets out of dishonesty. Some keep them because the secret isn't theirs to tell yet. He hadn't thought of it that way. He thought about it now. They walked back to the house together, and Clara helped him with the chores he'd been falling behind on, and they didn't talk about the chamber again until evening, when they sat on the porch and watched the light fade across the ridge. What do you want, Dad? When this is over? I want the land to stay in the family. I want the debt cleared. I want to set up something that gives you choices you don't have now. Beyond that, I haven't thought it all the way through. What about the gold? The deposit? That's Helena's question. Mine is the land. The rest of it is means to the same end. She thought about that. Okay, she said. They sat for a while longer. The crow that lived in the Garland field called twice as the light went, then stopped. Eli let himself feel, for the first time in several days, something that resembled rest. The next morning the trouble started in earnest. Dale Combs came up the lane at 7 in the morning, driving his old pickup with the windshield wipers running even though it wasn't raining. He parked beside the equipment shed and got out slowly. Dale was 68 and had been Eli's neighbor for 30 years, a man who minded his own business so thoroughly that any visit at all was unusual. A visit before breakfast was the kind of thing that meant something had happened. Morning, Eli. Dale. Coffee. In a minute. I want to tell you something first. They stood beside Dale's truck. There was a man at my door yesterday afternoon. Asked if I knew you. Said he was a land surveyor doing a regional assessment of agricultural water resources. Asked questions about your operation. How long you'd been farming. Whether you'd had any unusual visitors recently. Whether you'd been doing any construction work on the property. Whether your wells were drawing well. Whether you'd had any issues with the soil composition in your fields. Eli kept his face neutral. What did you tell him? I told him I'd known you 30 years, and I didn't discuss my neighbor's business with strangers. He left a card. I didn't take it. He drove off in a dark blue sedan. Dale, I'm not asking. I'm telling you a man was asking about you, and I sent him away. You'll tell me what you want me to know when you're ready. But I wanted you to know he was around. Thank you. There's something else. Dale looked at the ground for a moment. 2 cars drove past my place yesterday evening, both of them slow, both of them looking at your driveway. They went up the road, turned around at the church, came back, drove past again. Not the kind of thing that happens out here. Whatever's going on, somebody's paying attention. Eli nodded. Whatever you need from me, just ask. I knew your father. I knew Wesley. The Pryors have been good neighbors. Priors look out for their land, and folks ought to look out for folks who do that. I appreciate it, Dale. Coffee now. They went inside. Dale met Clara, ate eggs Eli scrambled for both of them, drank his coffee, and left without asking what was going on. Eli was grateful for it. There was a kind of friendship in the hill country that operated on the principle that you didn't extract information from a friend, you waited for them to give it. Dale was a model of that kind. Helena called at 9. The title search was complete. The chain of title on the Pryor property was clean and continuous from the original 1881 deed. No severance, no sale of mineral rights, no partial transfers. The subsurface estate had remained with the surface estate for 143 years. That's the first piece. Now we move on the notice of claim. I'll have the filing prepared by Tuesday. I need you to sign it, get it notarized, and we'll lodge it Wednesday morning. The moment that filing is on the public record, the legal situation changes for Meridian. They'll know we know. They'll know we're not going to sell on their terms. The pressure will increase, but the legal protection will be much stronger. What kind of increase? Mr. Hale will probably want to meet with you in person. He'll be more direct than the letters have been. He may make a higher offer. He may make implicit threats. Document everything. Don't meet him alone. Don't sign anything. If he comes to the property without an appointment, ask him to leave. He'll comply, because making a record of trespass is the kind of mistake his employer cannot afford. Understood. There's something else. A licensed mining engineer named Burton Yates is in the region this week assessing a separate matter. I've spoken to him. He's available to come look at your survey documents and the chamber on Thursday, if that works. He's expensive, but he's the right person. I'd recommend authorizing him to do a preliminary assessment now, formal survey later. Authorize him. Done. He hung up and walked outside, where Clara was repairing one of the fence sections he'd been putting off, working with her shirt sleeves rolled to her elbows and her hair tied back. She looked up at him. Helena, title search came back clean. We're filing the notice of claim Wednesday. Good. She turned back to the fence. He watched her work for a moment. She'd helped him with fences when she was 12, 13, 14, before the years when she'd needed to be in her own room with her own thoughts more than she'd needed to be outside with him. He'd forgotten how much she remembered of how to do it. He thought about Wesley building the wall in 2 summers and saying things about the land holding things, and about Raymond who had never said anything unusual about anything, and about himself standing in a September yard watching his daughter rebuild a fence on land that was going to be the center of a fight he hadn't been ready for 2 weeks ago and was readier for now. The week proceeded in the rhythm Helena had described. The notice of claim was filed Wednesday morning. Eli signed it Tuesday evening with a notary in Harlan that Helena had vetted, and the filing went in at the Department for Natural Resources at 9 the following morning. By that afternoon, the existence of a prior mineral claim on the property was a matter of public record. Anyone who searched the database would find it. Anyone watching the database for activity on properties they were interested in acquiring would have an alert in their inbox within minutes. Marcus Hale's first call came Thursday at 10. Eli let it go to voicemail. The message was professional, courteous, and brief. Mr. Pryor, Marcus Hale with Meridian Land Holdings, calling to discuss the recent filing in the state record. We have some questions and would value the opportunity to talk through them with you directly. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. Eli forwarded the voicemail to Helena. She called him within an hour. Don't return the call. I'll respond on your behalf as your attorney. He's now on notice. From this point forward, all communication from Meridian goes through me. If they try to contact you directly, document the attempt and forward it to my office. How do you want to respond to his call? Briefly, acknowledge receipt. Confirm representation. Decline further communication until they make a written proposal to my office. Standard procedure. It establishes the legal frame. Will they make a written proposal? They will. It will probably arrive within a week. It will be higher than $340,000. It will include language about the recent filing being a misunderstanding that can be resolved with appropriate compensation. They will want to settle this quietly before Burton Yates produces a survey that values the deposit. The dollar amount of their next offer is going to tell us a great deal about what they already know. Burton Yates arrived Thursday afternoon. He was 61, lean, with a forester's tan and the careful walk of a man whose knees had been giving him trouble for some time. He carried equipment that made Gerald's tools look basic by comparison, sampling kits, magnetic survey instruments, ground-penetrating radar in a small case. He shook Eli's hand and Clara's, declined coffee, and asked to see the chamber. He spent 4 hours down there. He worked through Caleb's survey documents with the focused attention of a man reading something he'd been doing for 40 years. He took readings around the chamber walls and the floor that he said would help him correlate the underground structure with the surface geology. He examined the gold bars from the first crate Eli had opened. Eli had left it open as Helena had recommended and made notes about the casting style and the visible alloy characteristics. When he came up at the end of the day, he sat on the porch with Eli and Clara and a glass of water and looked out at the ridge for a long moment before he spoke. Your great-great-grandfather knew what he was doing. The survey work is correct as far as I can verify it from the documentation. The geology of the region is consistent with what he described. The probability that a vein at the depth and thickness he reported actually exists where he reported it is, in my professional judgment, very high. Will I confirm it without a modern survey? No. I won't put a number on the deposit without a survey. But I will tell you that the documentation is good enough that I'd take this work seriously if it had been given to me by a colleague today. What does a modern survey involve? Test bores at minimum 3 locations across the indicated vein. Core analysis at a certified laboratory. Magnetic and resistivity surveys of the surrounding rock to map the vein's extent. 2 to 3 months of work. About $60,000 in costs. I can do most of it personally with a small crew. Eli looked at Clara. She looked at him. He turned back to Burton. How do we pay for it without selling any of what's in the crates? You don't have to, Burton said. I'll do the work on contingency against the assessed value, like a lawyer takes a contingency fee. If the survey confirms a deposit of significant value, my fee is paid out of the eventual extraction or sale. If the survey shows nothing, you owe me cost. That's not generosity. That's how I judge the probability of the deposit. I'm betting on it. Burton had been doing this work for 40 years, Helena had said. His contingency rate on assessments was a closely guarded figure. He took roughly 1 in 12 cases that came to him, and the cases he took had a confirmation rate above 90% because he didn't bet on documentation that wouldn't stand up. The fact that he had walked through Caleb's survey work for 4 hours and come up willing to absorb $60,000 of risk on his own back was the strongest professional signal Eli had received from anyone since the discovery. Burton was not a man who took bets that didn't pay. He had looked at the documentation and made his own quiet calculation, and his calculation was that the deposit was there and at the scale Caleb had described. Helena had told Eli that Burton's involvement was an indicator of how seriously the documentation was being taken in the professional community. The contingency offer underlined that. He shook Burton's hand again, said yes, and they set a start date for the following Monday. He drove a small white pickup that was older than most of the equipment on Eli's farm, and that had been kept in a state of careful working order that suggested the same disposition Burton brought to his professional work. There was no display in the choice. Burton was a man who paid for things that worked and didn't pay for things that signaled. Eli had been around enough working men to recognize the type, and to take it as another small confirmation that he was now surrounded by the kind of people he was going to be able to trust through what came next. Burton drove off into the evening light. Eli and Clara stood on the porch. Dad. Yes. This is really happening. It is. I don't know what I feel about it yet. Neither do I. They went inside. He made dinner. Clara washed the dishes after. They sat at the kitchen table and looked at the notepad where the column of debts was, and where Helena's name was, and where the names of other people now lined up below it: Burton Yates, Gerald Marsh, the Bar Association referral number, a notary in Harlan, and a phone number for the Department for Natural Resources Records Office. The list had grown. It would keep growing. Outside, the September night was cold and clear. The crow had stopped calling. The creek made its sound below the ridge. Somewhere on the county road, perhaps, a dark blue sedan was driving slowly past the end of the lane, or perhaps not. Eli no longer assumed either way. He had moved past the point where the surveillance was the disturbing fact and into the point where it was simply one of the operating conditions. Marcus Hale's written proposal arrived Saturday by certified mail. Eli signed for it, opened it at the kitchen table with Clara watching, and read it through twice. The new offer was $850,000. The language was different from the earlier letters. It opened with a paragraph acknowledging Mr. Pryor's recent state filing and characterizing it as based on incomplete information about the actual subsurface conditions of the property. It described Meridian's prior offer as reflecting market value for agricultural land, without consideration of speculative subsurface claims. It then described the new offer as a generous accommodation that acknowledged the property's historical character and the family's long tenure on the land. It included a confidentiality clause prohibiting public discussion of the transaction. It included a release of all future claims related to the property's subsurface estate. It set a response deadline of November 15th, 2 weeks earlier than the previous deadline. Eli photographed it and sent it to Helena. She called within 20 minutes. 850,000. That tells us something. What? That they think the deposit is real and significant, but they're betting we don't have a survey yet that establishes it. They're trying to settle at a price that looks generous next to their first offer, but is a fraction of what the deposit is worth. The confidentiality clause is to keep the precedent out of the public record. The release of future claims is the kill shot. If you sign this, you can never come back and assert a claim no matter what gets developed on the property. What do? We respond. I'll draft it Monday. The response acknowledges receipt, declines the offer, and notifies Meridian that a survey is in progress. That changes the calculus. Once they know there's a survey, they have two choices. Keep raising their offer based on guesses about what the survey will show, or wait for the survey and negotiate on the actual number. Most companies of this kind will choose the second, but it commits them to a longer engagement, which is what we want. Why? Because the longer this takes, the more documentation we accumulate, the more publicly visible the dispute becomes, and the more expensive it gets for them to suppress. Tom is on our side now. It wasn't 2 weeks ago, but it is now. He hung up. Clara was watching him. What did she say? That 850,000 tells them they think it's real. That we say no. That we wait for the survey. Are you okay saying no to 850,000? He thought about it. 2 months ago, $850,000 would have ended every conversation in his head, would have paid off every debt with hundreds of thousands left, would have changed the entire shape of his options. He could feel that earlier version of himself in the chair, the man who would have accepted this offer without hesitation and considered himself unaccountably lucky. It was a strange thing to look back at a version of yourself you'd been only 2 months ago and find him both familiar and clearly outdated. That man had been carrying assumptions about what was possible that were no longer accurate. He'd been making peace with a particular ending. The peace had not been wrong, given what he'd known. It had simply been a peace negotiated against a smaller landscape than the actual one. The actual landscape, the chamber, the vein, the documentation, the people now lined up with him in this was wider than he'd been letting himself imagine, and the wider landscape demanded different decisions than the narrower one had. He wasn't that man anymore. The information had changed. The frame had changed. He had a chamber under his north wall, and a survey in progress, and an attorney building a case, and a daughter who had stayed through the week, and a deposit at 90 feet. That was the inheritance of his blood, whether he sold it or not. Yes, he said. I'm okay saying no. Clara nodded slowly. Then we say no. He looked out the kitchen window at the September dark. The wall was out there, and below the wall the chamber, and below the chamber the vein, and above all of it the farm that had been in his family for 143 years. The terms of the situation had become clear enough to act on. The next decision was going to be made on his terms, or not at all. He wrote a single sentence in the notepad below the column of debts and the names of his allies, in pen this time, because the situation now justified the permanence. We do not sell. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went upstairs and slept, for the first time in 2 weeks, all the way through to morning. He woke to the gray of an October dawn coming in through the bedroom window, and for a moment he didn't remember why he felt different. Then he did. The decision had been made the night before, and he had not undone it in his sleep. Some decisions you woke up doubting. This one he woke up confirming. The day ahead would bring whatever it brought. He was ready for it. Burton's crew arrived Monday before dawn. 3 vehicles coming up the lane in convoy, headlights cutting through the October fog that had settled in the hollow overnight. Burton drove the lead truck. The other 2 were a small flatbed carrying drilling equipment and a panel van full of survey instruments and the cabling for the magnetic readings. The crew was 4 men, all of them in their 50s and 60s, the kind of working professionals who had probably been doing exactly this kind of work for most of their adult lives, and who moved with the economy of people who had stopped wasting effort on motion that didn't accomplish anything. Eli met them at the equipment shed with coffee in a thermos and Clara beside him. Burton introduced the crew briefly: Vern, Tom, Otis, Mick, and gave Eli the schedule for the week. Site set up Monday. First test bore on the east field beginning Tuesday morning. Magnetic and resistivity surveys running concurrently. A second bore by Thursday if conditions held. Core samples to a certified laboratory in Lexington by Friday. Preliminary results in his hand within 14 days. We work clean, Burton said. Trucks stay on the lane. Equipment stays in the field corner. We restore what we disturb. By the time we leave, you'll have to look hard to find where we set up. Eli nodded. He'd expected nothing less from Burton based on the way Burton had been on his first visit. Burton was a man who treated other people's land the way he wanted his own treated, and the crew had been hired on the basis of similar discipline. The first day went exactly as Burton had described. The flatbed was unloaded, the drilling rig assembled at the east field corner, the magnetic survey lines laid out across the ridge with a precision that involved a lot of standing still and reading instruments and looking thoughtful. By dusk, the camp was set up, 3 trucks parked in a row, equipment covered against weather, a generator humming behind the panel van for the instruments that needed continuous power. That night, the headlights came down the county road and slowed at the end of the lane the way they'd been slowing for 2 weeks. 2 cars now. The first slowed, paused, continued. The second slowed, paused, continued. Eli watched from the kitchen window with Clara behind him. The cars did not turn into the lane. They simply confirmed, as they did every evening, that something was being watched. Helena called Tuesday morning. Meridian filed a request for environmental review with the state. They're claiming the survey activity constitutes ground disturbance that requires environmental impact study before proceeding. It's a delay tactic. The drilling Burton is doing falls below the threshold that triggers review. The state will dismiss it within a week, but they may pause your activity in the meantime, depending on which department processes the filing. How serious? Not serious. Annoying. We were expecting something like this. I'm filing a response this afternoon. Burton will keep working unless the state issues a stop order, which they won't. The function of the filing is to harass us and to create a paper trail Meridian can point to later if they need to argue you proceeded carelessly. Document everything Burton does, every step. That documentation will be what we use to invalidate the filing. Understood. He hung up. Burton was already in the field. The drilling rig had begun its work shortly after sunrise, and the steady mechanical chug of it carried through the still morning air across the ridge. Clara was on the porch with her laptop, working remotely as she'd promised her firm, fielding emails between intervals of watching the field where the rig was turning slowly in its assembly. I never thought I'd be sitting on the porch watching for industrial sabotage, she said when he came out with coffee. It's not industrial sabotage. It's a state environmental filing. Same thing in different clothes. He didn't argue. The first bore hit the quartz vein on Wednesday afternoon at 88 feet of depth. Burton came to the house with the news himself, walking up the lane from the field with his hat in his hand and his face arranged. In the particular careful neutrality of a man who had something significant to say and was trying not to oversell it. We're in it, Eli. Vein thickness at the first sampling looks to be in the range of 5 to 6 feet. Quartz host rock, gold visible in surface examination, more in the core sample than I've seen in any single vein in this region in 10 years. Lab analysis will tell us more, but my preliminary read is that Caleb's estimate is going to come in low. Eli sat down on the porch step. Clara came out of the house. Burton handed her a small, clear vial. Inside, suspended in a clear preservation fluid, was a thumbnail-sized piece of quartz with metallic flecks running through it, visible even in the low afternoon light. The texture of it dense and irregular and absolutely undeniable. She looked at it for a long moment. This is from our land. 88 feet down, in the east field, the location your great-great-grandfather mapped in 1885. The sample I just gave you was extracted 4 hours ago. She handed it to Eli. He held it. The vial was small and the weight of the sample inside, it was negligible. The implications were not. How much, Burton? I won't give you a number until the lab finishes the assays. I won't say a thing publicly until I have a full survey across 3 bore sites. But privately, talking to you, on the front porch, with no one writing it down, the deposit is significant. It is, as I told you the first time I came up here, very high probability. What I can tell you now is that it is also probably larger than Caleb estimated, and probably higher grade than he estimated. The man was a careful surveyor. He was also a conservative one. He wrote down what he could prove. The deposit appears to be more than he could prove with the tools he had. Eli nodded slowly. Clara sat down on the step beside him. How long until the lab results? 12 to 14 days. I'll have the second bore done by Friday. The third bore, depending on weather. By the time we're 3 weeks out, you'll have a survey report you can take to anyone. Burton left them on the porch. He walked back down to the field, where the rig was being repositioned for the second bore. Eli sat holding the vial. Clara watched her father. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Dad, yes. This is real. It is. What does it mean? He thought about that for a while. It means Caleb was right about everything. It means Helena's strategy was right. It means we're going to be in this fight for the rest of the year and probably into next year. It means the farm stays. It means you have choices you didn't have a month ago. And it means we're going to need to think very carefully about what comes after, because what comes after is going to define the family for generations. She nodded. She rested her head against his shoulder for a moment, the way she'd done as a child when she'd been processing something larger than she had words for, and he sat very still and let her. The pressure increased through the second week of October. A man in a county uniform came up the lane on Wednesday afternoon, claiming to be conducting a roadside ditch inspection along the property frontage. He carried a clipboard and an air of bureaucratic legitimacy. Eli met him at the equipment shed and asked for identification. The man produced a county employee badge. Eli photographed it. The man asked if he could walk the eastern boundary to assess drainage from the field. Eli said no. The man said it was a routine inspection. Eli said he was happy to facilitate the inspection if it was scheduled in advance through the county office and accompanied by the appropriate documentation. The man left. Eli called the county roads office. The supervisor confirmed that no inspection had been scheduled and no inspector had been authorized for the area that day. The badge was real. The inspection was not. Helena added it to the documentation file. Friday morning, Eli found that the lock on the equipment shed had been picked. Nothing was missing. Nothing was moved. The lock simply showed the unmistakable scratches of a tool being worked against it, the kind of marks that a careful examination revealed but that a casual look would have missed. He photographed the lock. He installed a new one. He set up a small camera in the rafters facing the door, the kind that ran on a motion sensor, and stored its footage on a card that nobody but Eli knew was there. The next morning, a different car was at the end of the lane. Beige sedan, paper plates, the kind of unmarked vehicle that was either a private investigator's car or something close to it. It stayed for almost an hour before leaving. Eli stopped sleeping past 5 in the morning. Clara moved her remote work to the kitchen table so she could see the lane. They ate meals in shifts. They locked doors that had not been locked in 50 years. Marcus Hale came up the lane on the third Wednesday of October. It was 3 in the afternoon. The drilling rig was operating in the east field on the second bore. Burton's crew was visible from the porch, for men in coveralls working with the economy that had become familiar over 2 weeks. The day was clear and cool with the kind of light that fall in eastern Kentucky did better than any other season, sharp and gold and honest about everything it touched. Eli was on the porch when the silver Mercedes turned in. He saw it coming up the lane and recognized it without ever having seen it before. A vehicle that announced itself in a way that working men's vehicles did not. He set his coffee cup down and stood up. Clara stepped out of the house behind him. The Mercedes parked in the gravel turnaround. The driver who emerged was not what Eli had expected. He'd expected a corporate executive, the polished kind with a suit and a manner. What got out was a man in his late 50s wearing a barn jacket and jeans and work boots, with a face that had spent time outdoors and a build that suggested a person who knew how to do physical work even if he no longer did it for a living. He looked, in fact, much more like Burton than like a corporate acquirer. The clothes were chosen, Eli understood. The performance was already underway. Mr. Pryor. Marcus Hale. I'd like a few minutes of your time. Eli did not extend his hand. My attorney has told you to direct all communication through her office. She has. I understand. I'm here as a courtesy. I won't ask you to negotiate. I won't make an offer. I just want to talk for a few minutes. I think it'll be worth your while. My attorney advised against meeting in person. I know that. I'm asking anyway, on the chance you'll decide for yourself rather than letting an attorney decide for you. If you say leave, I leave. I won't come back. But I'm here, and I'd like to talk. Clara moved up beside her father. Hale looked at her, nodded politely, did not extend his hand. This is my daughter. Anything you say in front of her. Of course. Eli considered. He understood that meeting Hale was a violation of Helena's instructions and that any conversation could be used against him later. He also understood that letting Hale leave without hearing what he had to say would be giving up information about the shape of the negotiation that he might benefit from understanding. He was not afraid of Hale. He was specifically not afraid of Hale because he had Burton in the field and Helena on the phone and Clara at his shoulder and a chamber full of documented evidence under the north wall. The fear that Hale's job depended on creating was a fear that Eli no longer had access to. 5 minutes. Standing here. My daughter stays. That's fine. Hale leaned against the front fender of the Mercedes. He did not produce papers. He did not refer to documents. He spoke with the casualness of a man who'd done this many times. I'm going to be direct with you because I think you respect directness. Grayfield Capital has been pursuing Appalachian mineral rights for 15 years. We have a model that works. We buy land at agricultural prices, we extract what's there at industrial scale, and we exit before the cycle turns. The model depends on information advantages. We know what's under properties before the owners do, and we acquire at prices that reflect the surface use rather than the subsurface value. This is not a secret. This is the publicly understood business model of natural resource investment. We do not invent it. We participate in it. He paused. Eli said nothing. You have information we did not have. Your great-great-grandfather did sampling work we don't have access to. He left documentation that's now in your possession. Your engineer is confirming it. That changes the equation. You are no longer at the information disadvantage that allows our standard model to work. I'm aware. What I'd like to discuss, Mr. Pryor, is a different model. One in which we acknowledge the information balance and structure a deal that reflects it. We would extract the deposit on a royalty basis. You retain ownership of the land and the surface estate. You receive a percentage of net production from the operation. We assume all costs of extraction, permitting, environmental remediation, and exit. You become the largest single beneficiary of a long-term resource project on land that remains in your family's name. The percentage would be the subject of negotiation, but it would be substantial. Eli looked at him. How substantial? That depends on the survey. If the deposit is what your engineer's preliminary work suggests, we would be prepared to discuss a royalty in the range of 12 to 15% of net. Over the productive life of the deposit, which we'd estimate at 20 to 30 years, that figure would compound into a number that I think would surprise you. Eli did not respond immediately. He understood that Hale was offering, in effect, exactly the structure that Helena had said Grayfield could not offer, a model that left the land with the family while extracting the value beneath it. He understood that 12 to 15% of net was almost certainly negotiable upward, that the offer was an opening rather than a fixed proposal. He also understood that the question of whether to negotiate this kind of arrangement was the question he had told Clara was going to define the family for generations. Why are you here, Mr. Hale? Personally. Today. Hale almost smiled. Because the alternative is bad for everyone. If we don't reach an arrangement, this becomes a legal case. The case becomes public. The publicity attracts attention to the broader Appalachian mineral rights market. Adjacent landowners realize what their land may be worth. Other families come forward. Grayfield's model breaks. We lose hundreds of millions in pending acquisitions across 4 states. You spend 2 years in litigation. Both of us spend money that doesn't need to be spent. I would prefer a structured agreement that resolves this matter without the precedent. You would, I think, prefer to receive royalty payments rather than legal bills. You're threatening the entire industry to get me to settle. I'm describing the structure of the industry. The threat is implicit in the structure. I am not making it personal. I'm telling you why we have a mutual interest in resolution. Eli thought about it. Clara watched. Burton's crew was visible in the field. The drilling rig turned its steady mechanical rotation in the October light. I'll discuss your proposal with my attorney. She'll respond to your firm in writing within 2 weeks. I'm not making any commitment in this conversation. Anything you've said today is not binding on either of us. I want that explicit. Of course. This is informal. You should leave now. Hale nodded. He pushed off the fender. He looked at the field where the rig was working, then at the north wall, which was visible from the turnaround. He looked at the wall for a moment longer than seemed strictly necessary. Beautiful land, Mr. Pryor. I understand why it matters to you. Goodbye, Mr. Hale. The Mercedes started, turned, drove down the lane. They watched it go. Clara let out a long breath when it had disappeared into the trees. Dad, I know. He looked at the wall. I noticed. They know where the chamber is. They've known for at least a week. The drilling locations match Caleb's map. They've had time to put the pieces together. She was quiet for a moment. What do you think of his offer? I think it's the offer Helena said they couldn't make. Which means either she was wrong, which is possible but unlikely, or he was authorized to make it because the situation has progressed past their normal playbook. I think he's frightened, in the careful corporate way that frightened men present themselves as confident. And I think we should consider it seriously, because the structure he described is actually closer to what I want than any of their previous offers. What about the rest? That's why we have Helena. He stood in the kitchen for a moment after Hale's Mercedes had disappeared down the lane. Clara was watching him. He understood that the conversation had been a small piece of theater designed to communicate several things at once. Hale had wanted to demonstrate that he could come to the property in person without intimidation, that he respected Eli enough to negotiate face-to-face, that the firm had reached a point where the previous tactics had been set aside. All of that was likely true. It was also the case that Hale had been there to gather information, to see the operation, to confirm the chamber's location, to read Eli's posture and Clara's, to take back to Grayfield an assessment of what the negotiation was actually going to require. He had done a competent job of both performances at once. Eli respected that, in the way you respected a skilled adversary even while taking precautions against them. He went inside and called her. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. 12 to 15% is negotiable upward. The structure is interesting. The fact that he made this offer in person, without a paper trail, tells us something. He's testing whether you'd accept this kind of arrangement before committing it to writing. The fact that he came out himself rather than sending someone tells us something else. He's the principal acquirer for the region, and his bonus depends on closing this. He's now personally invested in finding a path. That gives us leverage we can use. What's our response? We let his offer sit for a week without acknowledgement. That tells him you're not desperate. Then we counter at 25% of net, with a guaranteed minimum and surface use restrictions. He'll counter at 18. We settle in the range of 20 to 22. Burton's survey will give us the leverage we need to anchor the negotiation at a defensible number. The survey report comes in next week. We negotiate from a position of professional documentation rather than from a position of speculation. And the press stays out of it for now. The minute this becomes public, the leverage changes. Right now you're a single farmer with an old letter. The moment it's a story, you're a precedent and you become a target. We keep it quiet through settlement. Then we go public if we choose to, on our terms, at a moment that benefits the agreement we've signed. Okay, one more thing. Hale looked at the wall. They know about the chamber. They will, at some point in the next 2 weeks, attempt to acquire the contents. Not by force, by a quieter route. An offer to take the gold off your hands at favorable terms, perhaps. Or an offer to handle custody during the litigation period. Refuse anything they propose related to the chamber's contents. The crates stay where they are until I tell you otherwise. We will move them when we move them, on our schedule, to a location that is not on this property. Understood. He hung up. Clara was sitting at the kitchen table. Dad, Helena's working it. We'll counter next week. That's not what I want to ask. He looked at her. What is it? What are we doing with the gold? The crates. Not the deposit, the gold that's already extracted. Caleb's bars. He had thought about this. He had thought about it more than he'd told anyone, including her. He had a beginning of an answer, but he hadn't articulated it yet, hadn't tested it against speaking it out loud. He sat down across from her. I've been thinking about that. Caleb extracted $75 million worth of gold by hand over 8 years and hid it because there was no honest market for it in 1891. The money in those crates is, in a real sense, money he set aside for the family. It belongs to us in a way the deposit doesn't, because the deposit is land and what comes from the land. The bars are something different. They're savings. So we keep them. Some of them. Enough to pay the debts. Enough to set you up. Enough to make sure the farm has resources to run on for the next several years without needing to take on operating loans. The rest, I want to set up something with. A trust, maybe. For Appalachian families with mineral rights they don't know they have. Or for a county program that helps people understand what their land contains before they sell it. Something that would have helped Caleb if it had existed in 1885. She looked at him for a long moment. Dad, what? That's a good idea. He nodded. He looked out the kitchen window at the ridge. The light was going amber on the high pasture, the way it did in the late afternoon when the year was turning toward winter. It came from the land. It should benefit the land, or the people on it. Caleb would approve. I hope so. They sat at the table while the light kept changing. Outside, the drilling rig wound down for the evening. Burton's crew began braking for the day. The October air moved through the open kitchen window and carried the smell of wood smoke from somewhere. Down the holler, somebody's first fire of the season. The crisis came on a Sunday night. Eli woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of his motion sensor camera's app chiming on his phone. He'd installed 3 of them across the property in the last week, 1 on the equipment shed, 1 in the rafters of the barn, and 1 in a high birch tree facing the north wall. The chime indicated activity from the 3rd camera. He sat up. Clara was already awake in the next room. He could hear her phone chiming too. They met in the hallway. He pulled up the camera feed on his phone. The infrared image was grainy but clear enough. 2 figures in dark clothing were standing at the north wall. One held something that looked like a digital instrument. The other was lifting a corner of the tarp Eli had weighted across the chamber opening. He called the Harlan County Sheriff's Department from the kitchen. The dispatcher took the report calmly. A patrol unit could be on the property in 20 to 25 minutes. Then he called Helena. She picked up on the second ring despite the hour. They're at the wall, he said. 2 of them. I've called the sheriff. Stay inside. Do not approach them. Document with the camera. Let the sheriff handle it. Do not give them an excuse to claim self-defense. Stay inside. He stayed inside. Clara stood beside him at the kitchen window. He couldn't see the wall from the house in the dark, but the camera feed continued on his phone. The 2 figures had pulled the tarp back. One was photographing the entrance to the stairwell. The other was lifting the camera up and apparently looking down the steps with his own flashlight. They did not descend. After perhaps 4 minutes, they replaced the tarp roughly, weighted it with the same stones Eli had used, and walked back toward the tree line along the Garland property boundary, where they presumably had a vehicle. By the time the sheriff's deputy arrived, they were gone. The deputy was a younger man, late 20s, who Eli had not met before. He took the report carefully, watched the camera footage, took copies of the relevant clips on a thumb drive. He examined the wall, the tarp, the stairwell entrance. He did not ask what was down the stairs. Eli appreciated the restraint. The deputy was either professional enough not to ask questions outside the scope of the report he was filing, or he had been instructed not to. Either was acceptable. You have an attorney representing you in some matter related to the property? Helena Rourke in Lexington. I'll include her contact in the report. The detectives will want to follow up Monday morning. There's evidence of trespass and probably attempted breaking and entering, depending on what's in the stairwell. But that's a discussion for the detectives, not me. He paused. Mr. Pryor, anything you want me to know that isn't in the report? Eli thought about it. Not yet. My attorney will be in touch with the department Monday. Fair enough. The deputy handed him a card. Anything happens between now and then, call me directly. I'll be on shift. He left. Eli and Clara sat at the kitchen table until the sky began to gray in the east. Neither of them tried to sleep again. Helena called at 7 Monday morning. This changes things. They've crossed into criminal territory. Trespass is one thing. Attempted access to a structure on the property is another. The camera footage establishes intent. The sheriff will investigate. The local press may pick it up. Grayfield's calculus shifts significantly the moment any of this becomes public. What's our move? 2 parts. First, I'm filing a formal complaint with the Kentucky Attorney General's office today, alleging coordinated harassment and now attempted criminal entry by parties associated with Grayfield Capital. I'm including the camera footage, the documentation we've accumulated, the timeline of the surveillance. The AG's office may or may not take action. The filing itself is the point. It creates a parallel investigation that runs independently of the civil matter. And the second part, we accelerate the settlement. We're not going to slow walk this anymore. Their attempted entry tells us their internal pressure has reached a point where they're authorizing risk that exposes them. That means they're prepared to settle on terms that work for us. I'm sending the counteroffer today rather than waiting. 25% of net, guaranteed minimum, surface use restrictions, plus an acknowledgement of trespass and harassment over the past month built into the agreement as part of the dispute resolution. The acknowledgement is the price of avoiding criminal exposure on the trespass. Will they take it? They'll counter. We'll settle within 30 days. Burton's final survey will be in our hands by then, and we'll have the leverage to anchor the numbers. She was right about all of it. The counteroffer went out Monday. Grayfield's response came on Thursday, a long letter from a senior corporate attorney that disputed many of Helena's factual claims, denied any institutional knowledge of the trespass, and proposed a different structure that involved a smaller royalty percentage but a substantial upfront payment. Helena dismissed it. Negotiations continued through written exchanges over the next 3 weeks. Burton's final survey arrived on the third Friday of November. He delivered it in person, driving up the lane in his small white pickup, carrying a bound report and a leather portfolio of documents. He sat at the kitchen table with Eli and Clara and walked them through the contents with the same care he'd used in everything else. The deposit was significantly larger than Caleb had estimated. The vein ran for approximately 380 feet along the eastern portion of the property at depths ranging from 82 to 110 feet. Vein thickness averaged 5.7 feet across the surveyed extent. The grade was consistent with high-quality, gold-bearing quartz formations. Burton's tonnage estimate, derived from the assay results and the magnetic surveys, was 2.4 times Caleb's original figure. At current gold prices, the recoverable value of the deposit was estimated at approximately $410 million, plus or minus 8%, depending on extraction efficiency and price fluctuations across the productive life of the operation. Eli sat with the number for a while. Clara held the report. Burton, yes. Caleb didn't know how big it was. He couldn't have. His sampling reached the section of the vein he could access at 90 feet. The deposit deepens to the south and east in a direction he had no way of surveying with hand tools. He saw what he could see. What he saw was already enough to justify everything he did. The rest he couldn't have known about, but the rest is real. Helena received the survey report Friday afternoon. She called Eli Saturday morning. We have what we need. I'm presenting the final terms to Grayfield Monday. 23% of net, guaranteed annual minimum of $2 million. Surface use restricted to a defined extraction zone that does not impact the eastern field beyond a strict perimeter. Full environmental remediation bonded in advance. Written acknowledgement of the prior harassment incorporated into the agreement, and a non-disclosure clause that runs against Grayfield rather than against you. You can speak publicly about the case. They cannot. What's the inverted NDA worth to them? Everything. It's the reason they'll sign. It protects them from precedent in the short term while still giving us the public voice when we choose to use it. They'd rather have asymmetric silence than no silence at all. You think they'll sign it? They'll counter. They'll try to make the NDA mutual. We'll refuse. They'll sign anyway because the alternative is litigation that exposes the trespass and the harassment campaign. The criminal exposure is what closes this. Without it, we might be in court for 2 years. With it, we're closed by Christmas. She was right again. The settlement was signed on December 14th in Helena's office in Lexington. Eli signed on his side of the table. Grayfield's attorney signed on the other. Hill was not present. Eli understood that his absence was deliberate, the same way his casual clothes had been deliberate during the visit to the farm. Hale was the personal face of the firm, and the firm was using his face strategically. He would surface again later, in different contexts. Today, the corporate attorneys handled the paperwork. The terms were as Helena had described. 23% of net production. $2 million annual guaranteed minimum. Surface use restricted to the eastern extraction zone. Environmental remediation fully bonded. Written acknowledgement of the prior harassment, phrased carefully but unmistakably present in Section 19 of the agreement. Asymmetric non-disclosure. Grayfield could not speak about the case or its terms, but Eli could. royalty payments quarterly, with audit rights. The full mineral rights remained with the Pryor estate. Grayfield held only an extraction lease for the surveyed deposit, expiring at the conclusion of the productive operation. Eli set his pen down. He looked across the table at the Grayfield attorney, who was packing his briefcase with the careful neutrality of a man who'd just lost a negotiation and was determined not to show it. Mr. Reynolds. Mr. Pryor. Tell Mr. Hale I think the structure he proposed back in October was fair. I appreciated his coming to the property himself. The attorney nodded. I'll convey the message. Eli and Helena and Clara left the office together. Outside, Lexington's December afternoon was clear and cold, the sun low across the city, the sidewalks busy with people moving through their Saturday errands. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment before separating. Thank you, Helena. You did the work, Eli. I just structured it. Take care of your daughter. Take care of the farm. Call me when you're ready to discuss the foundation. She walked back toward her office. Eli and Clara walked toward Eli's truck. Dad, yes. It's actually over. This part is. The next part is just starting. He drove them back to Harlan County in the early dark. The drive took 2.5 hours along roads he'd known his whole life. And as the elevation began to climb and the suburbs gave way to the open hill country, and then to the dense second-growth forest that defined the eastern part of the state, he could feel the particular settling that came from going home. Clara was quiet in the passenger seat. He didn't try to fill the quiet. The first quarterly payment from Grayfield arrived in late March. It was the guaranteed minimum, since extraction had not yet begun. The amount, after Helena's continuing counsel fee and the foundation's allocation, left Eli with enough to pay off Farmers Credit of Kentucky in full, settle the equipment dealer in Harlan, clear the smaller debts on his notepad, and have substantial reserves for operating costs and farm improvements that he'd been deferring for years. He paid the bank first. He drove to the branch in Hazard and sat with the loan officer who'd been managing his account for 4 years and presented a cashier's check for $179,420. 16. The full remaining balance with payoff calculations updated through the date. The officer looked at the check, looked at Eli, looked at the check again. She had been carrying his account through 3 rounds of late payments, 2 restructurings, and a deferral arrangement that had been on the edge of impossible for months. She did not ask where the money had come from. She processed the payoff and gave him the documentation showing the account closed, the loan satisfied, the lien released. Mr. Pryor. Yes. It's been a pleasure managing your account. You've been very fair to me. I appreciate it. He drove home with the lien release in the truck. He stopped at the equipment dealer and paid them off the same way. He stopped at the electrician's office. He stopped at the veterinary clinic. By the end of the afternoon, every line item on his notepad had a date and a payment confirmation written beside it in his own hand, in pen, with the careful permanence of a man closing accounts that had defined the texture of his life for 3 years. The closing of the loan account felt different than he had expected it to feel. He had imagined, during the years of carrying the debt, that paying it off would arrive with some emotional release, some specific sensation of weight lifted. What he felt instead, sitting in the truck in the bank parking lot before he started the engine, was something quieter. Not relief. Acknowledgement. The years he had spent paying the loan down at $1,400 a month. The months when that $1,400 had felt like an impossible commitment. The times he had sat at the kitchen table after Margaret died doing the calculations that proved he could not make the payment and then making it anyway. None of that disappeared because the lien was released. The closing was a marker, not an erasure. He drove home understanding that. The land had been at risk for those years, and now it was not. And what remained was the work of farming it, which had been the work all along. He drove home in the late afternoon. The April light was different from October light, softer, more diffuse, carrying the green of new leaves coming in on the lower elevations, even though the higher pastures were still bare. He pulled into the farm lane and parked at the equipment shed and sat in the truck for a moment. Then he went to the wall. The chamber had been emptied in February. Burton and a small specialized team had transferred the contents of all 40 crates to a secured storage facility in Lexington under Helena's supervision. The historic provenance of the bars made them substantially more valuable than the gold spot price alone. Collectors and museums and a private foundation in Washington had already expressed interest in acquiring portions of the collection at premium prices. Helena was managing the sales carefully and in measured quantities. The proceeds were going partly to operating capital, partly to the foundation Eli and Clara had begun to establish, partly to a trust that would eventually pass to Clara's children if she had any. The chamber itself remained intact. The cabinet, the tin box, Caleb's letter, the rolled survey documents, all of it had been preserved in archival storage in the Kentucky State Library, under terms that gave Eli full ownership, but provided permanent conservation. Copies of everything were in 3 separate locations under Helena's protection. What was in the chamber now was air and stone, and the impressions in the floor where the crates had stood for 132 years. Eli descended the 12 steps with the lantern. He stood at the bottom and looked at the empty room. He had been down there many times since the discovery. He came down now alone, with the lantern, and stood and listened to the silence that the room had held for so long. The silence was still there. It had outlasted the contents. He sat on the lowest step of the stairs. He took the notepad from his shirt pocket. The column of debts was crossed through now, each entry marked with the date it had been paid. Below it, in the same hand, in pen, were the words he'd written months ago, "We do not sell." Below those words, more recently added, was a list of the people who had stood with him through what had followed. Helena, Burton, Gerald, Dale, the young deputy whose name he'd added after the trespass investigation closed. Clara, on her own line, separate. He looked at the list. He thought about Caleb Pryor sitting somewhere on this same farm in 1891, writing a letter to blood he would never meet, sealing it in wax, addressing it to the future without any assurance that the future would honor it. He thought about Wesley building the wall above the chamber in 1949, knowing or not knowing, carrying or not carrying. He thought about Raymond, who had farmed above all of it without any knowledge that it was there. He climbed the steps back up into the April light. The foundation was incorporated in the state of Kentucky on May 12th. Its full name was the Caleb Pryor Foundation for Appalachian Land Education. Its stated purpose was to provide free legal and geological consultation to landowners across Appalachia who suspected or believed their land contained subsurface resources that they did not fully understand. Its endowment, in its first year, was $15 million. Within 5 years, with the addition of continuing royalty income from the Grayfield extraction operation, the endowment would grow to approximately $40 million. The foundation operated out of a small office in Hazard with a director Eli and Clara had hired together, a woman named Adelaide Hatfield who had been an attorney for the Appalachian Citizens Law Center for 20 years and who had the right combination of legal expertise, community trust, and personal stubbornness to do the work. The story broke on June 3rd of the following year, in a feature article in the Lexington Herald-Leader that had been negotiated and prepared with Helena's full involvement. The article was thorough. It walked through the history of the Pryor land, Caleb's discovery and decision, the chamber and its contents, the survey by Burton Yates, the harassment campaign by Grayfield Capital, the trespass incident, and the settlement that had followed. It included the asymmetric NDA's effect. Grayfield could not respond on the record. It included quotes from Eli, from Clara, from Helena, from Adelaide. It included a list of resources for landowners who wanted to understand whether their land contained similar deposits. The article was picked up by the New York Times the following week. The Washington Post followed. The story had legs of a kind Eli had not anticipated. Adjacent landholders began calling the foundation. Within 2 months, the foundation had taken on cases for 16 Appalachian families who had received offers from Grayfield-related entities or from similar firms. Within a year, 3 of those families had filed mineral rights claims that paralleled what Eli had filed. 2 had reached settlements. 1 was in active litigation. Grayfield's regional acquisition pipeline contracted by an estimated 40% in the 18 months following the article. Hale was reassigned to a different region. 2 of Grayfield's portfolio companies were restructured. The Grayfield model didn't break, but it was substantially altered by the new information environment in which the Pryor case had become the public reference point. Eli read the coverage. He gave one in-person interview to the Lexington paper at the beginning. He declined every other interview request. He understood that his role in the public story was to be the source documentation, not the ongoing commentator. The story would do what it would do. His job was the farm. He kept farming. In the second year after the settlement, with the operating capital that the royalty payments provided, he diversified. He bought back the old Garland tract, which had been on the market quietly through a probate process, and worked with a conservation easement organization to ensure that it could never be developed or commercially harvested. He invested in proper fencing across the entire property. He brought in 3 rescue horses from a Tennessee auction, the same way Caleb might have if Caleb had been the kind of man to take on animals nobody else wanted. He hired a young man named Bo Combsdale's grandson as a working farmhand, paid a fair wage with benefits, and began the slow process of teaching him what Wesley had taught Eli. Clara took a leave from her firm in Lexington and spent 6 months at the farm helping with the foundation's establishment. At the end of those 6 months, she returned to her firm, but began commuting on weekends. By the end of the second year, she had become engaged to a man named Owen Strickland, an engineer who specialized in renewable energy systems, and they were planning a wedding for the following spring on the farm itself. Clara had asked. Eli had said yes before she'd finished the question. The chamber stayed sealed. Eli had returned the slab to the entrance and built up the base of the wall around it in fitted drystone construction that matched the original. From above, the wall was complete again. The depression in the field had been carefully filled. The white oak stood where it had always stood, indifferent to the human arrangements that played out beneath it. The original Caleb Pryor letter was framed and hung in the foundation's office in Hazard. A copy hung in the kitchen of the farmhouse, between the window and the cabinet where the coffee cups went. Eli looked at it sometimes in the morning while the coffee brewed. He looked at it more often now than he had in the first months after the discovery, when he'd been too close to it to read it as something separable from the situation it had created. I could not make use of this in my lifetime without losing it to men who take what they want and call it commerce. Perhaps you can. The land knows what it holds, and it held it for you. Eli stood at the wall on a morning in October of the 3rd year, 3 years almost to the day from when he'd first pried the slab loose and discovered what lay beneath. The light was the same thin gold light of late September into October that the hills produced when the air was right. The white oak had begun to turn at the top, the leaves going copper before they fell. Burton's extraction operation was visible from the upper pasture as a small, carefully bounded site at the eastern corner, fenced and graded and managed with the discipline that Burton had insisted on as a condition of the lease. The operation was profitable. The royalty checks arrived quarterly and now substantially exceeded the guaranteed minimum. Clara and Owen would be at the farm for the weekend. Adelaide was coming up Sunday afternoon for a foundation board meeting. Dale Combs had been by Friday with a question about a piece of fence line that needed attention along the lower pasture, the kind of question that had once been a normal exchange between neighbors and that Eli now received as the gift it had always been. He stood at the wall in his work jacket and put his hand against the stones. They were the same stones Wesley had set in 1949 and that Caleb had set into a different configuration in 1883. The land that held the wall was the same land that had held it through both. Underneath the wall, the chamber. Underneath the chamber, the vein. Underneath all of it, the careful patience of a family that had paid attention to what was in its keeping across 5 generations. He had thought, in the months after the settlement, that he would write a letter of his own to be sealed and stored against some future moment. He had drafted it twice and abandoned it both times. The letter Caleb had written was the letter that needed to exist. Eli's job was not to write a new one. Eli's job was to be the blood the letter had been addressed to and to act accordingly. He had done that. He would keep doing it for as long as he was able. After him, it would be Clara, and after Clara, whoever came next. Some inheritances arrived through legal documents and bank transfers. Others arrived through letters sealed against the future by men who had no way of knowing whether the future would honor them. The first kind could be measured in dollars and acreage. The second kind required something different to receive. You had to be ready to accept that what had been left to you was not the wealth itself, but the obligation that accompanied it, the trust that had been placed in you across an absence of a century. The expectation that you would do with the inheritance what its origin had hoped you would. Caleb had trusted his blood without any way of knowing his blood would be worth trusting. The trust had not been misplaced. That was the part that mattered. The dollars and the acreage were the visible parts of the inheritance. The trust kept being the part that defined what the visible parts were for. He took his hand off the stones. He walked back to the house in the October light. Inside, the coffee was warm in the pot, and the morning was beginning, and the farm was his to keep. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.